Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Among his essays, Michel de Montaigne has a short one which is titled How We Weep and Laugh at the Same Thing, and that's one example of the seeming contradiction within our behavior, which signifies a deeper contradiction of our emotions, perhaps motivations. We're kind of a mess, you could say. And Montaigne takes this as not only being something that is normal, but something that we can provide an explanation for, as well as many examples of. So it's an intelligible phenomenon, and it's eminently human, he thinks. It may not apply to everyone. There may be a few exceptions, but most of us are going to be like this. And he's going to give a lot of different examples of people who are feeling what we would call contradictory emotions. So in the title, weeping and laughing at the same thing, which he says children do, we'll look at some other possible contrary things. And he begins by talking about Antigonus being displeased with his son for having brought him the head of his enemy, King Pyrrhus, who had just been killed fighting against him, and that he burst into copious tears when he saw it. And there's other examples, Julius Caesar. And you say, well, what's going on there? This is what you wanted. You're getting what you wanted, what you desired. Why aren't you happy? And they could, in fact, say, well, I am happy, but I'm also sad, right? Right now, I'm expressing this sadness. And he gives, in these examples, a whole bunch of interesting ways in which this is reflected in not just our words, but also our actions. Great example of this, one that I particularly like. He says, however noble the passion which inflames the heart of a well-born bride, she still has to have her arms prized from her mother's neck before being given to her husband, no matter what that merry fellow may say. She does want to get married. She loves her husband-to-be, and yet she doesn't want to take her arms from around the neck of her mother, leave her home, go to his home. What's going on there, right? And even our looks, he's got this great example from his own experience a little bit later on where he talks about, here we go, if anyone should think when he sees me sometimes look bleakly at my wife and sometimes lovingly, that either emotion is put on, he's daft. Sometimes I look at my wife as if she's the most beautiful, desirable woman in the world who I love above all others. Sometimes I look at her as if she's just any old person or just a thing. And Montaigne is saying, yeah, that happens. That is the way things are for us. Now, does this, he wants to ask, does this reflect something false, something counterfeit? He even uses the word, right? Are we acting? Are we hypocrites in the classic sense? Are we pretending to be something we're not? Are we engaging in deception? And he does point out, yeah, sometimes we are fooling people, right? He says that it is true that most of our actions are but mask and cosmetic, right? He's being a little bit pessimistic there. but he also says sometimes it's true, and he's got this great line which is coming from Lucan, behind the mask, the tears of an heir are laughter. We can have these seemingly contradictory emotions going on within us. How can that be? So he's going to give us an example, or not an example, an explanation here. He says we ought to consider, when judging these events, how our souls are often shaken, agitated, agité, by conflicting emotions, diverses passions. So passion is an emotion. We often use the word passion to talk about a particular emotion, the passion of anger, the passion of joy, and different, conflicting because they're different from each other. And so he begins by talking about bodies. Now, when he talks about humors, what he means in that, there was this theory that we no longer use in medicine of the four humors, and one of them could predominate in a person's body. So, for example, by having too much black bile, you could be melancholic. Melancholy is actually from the word for black bile. And so you'd be, sad a lot of the time, or perhaps choleric because of it, right? And other people would be phlegmatic. They've got too much of what makes them kind of passive, but also resilient. And will they always behave like that? Well, they've got all the humors in their body, and so most of the time one of them is predominating. But, there can be occasions where the dominant one actually is overruled. He says, in our souls, likewise, though diverse emotions can shake them, right? One passion is going to be the one that's dominant. It will remain in possession of the field. This is a military metaphor. It wins the battle. But he says its victory is not so complete that it dominates completely. He says the weaker ones do not sometimes regain lost ground because of the pliancy and mutability of our soul, and they make a brief sally. They go back out in their turn. So, our emotional makeup, our character, if you want to call it that, our personality, it's not a perfectly fixed thing. And so we've got this really interesting observation that he's going to make. No one single characteristic, qualité in French, embraces us, nous embrasse, completely, purement, and universally, entirely. We are a composite sort of thing, every single one of us. Even if we've trained ourselves to suppress these other urges, desires, emotions, drives, to be totally consistent, it's very difficult to do. So, this explains how this can happen. We are complex. And then he's going to give a whole bunch of examples of the common conflicts. So, weeping and laughing at the same thing. Children do this, he says. Not only children, but that not one of us either can boast that no matter how much he may want to. He's going to give some other examples. Set out on a journey. We're excited about going on the journey. And yet at the same time, we don't really want to leave home. We're going to miss the people that we're leaving behind. We feel our heart, he says, a tremble when we say goodbye to family and friends. Even if he does not actually burst into tears, at least he puts foot to stirrup with a sad and gloomy face. We don't ride horses that much. Getting on the train, catching the ride, right? Getting on the bus, whatever it happens to be, maybe getting on a bike instead of a horse, we are conflicted, right? He talks about lamenting the death of the person that you don't want alive. And so, he gave those examples at the beginning. This person is my enemy. You bring me their head. And now I'm like, oh, this is awful. And you're like, but this is what you wanted, right? So that's quite common. He talks about anger at his servant. And this one's actually quite worth bringing up, because it's kind of funny, isn't it? He says, when I rail at my manservant, I do so sincerely with all my mind. My curses, he's cursing him out, are real and not feigned. Once I cease to fume, if he needs help from me, I am glad to help him. I turn over the page. When I call him a dolt or a calf, now calf is vul, right? Sort of like calling somebody a cow. I have no intention of stitching labels on him forever, nor do I believe I'm contradicting myself when I later call him an honest fellow, right? Un honnête homme, which carries more than just the connotation of being honest. It means being a decent person. So on the one hand, you're an idiot, you're an a-hole. On the other hand, you're a great guy, right? Is one of them not meant and the other one is meant? They're both meant, because they're both deriving from our emotional outpourings, we could say. But they are contradictory with each other. So we're kind of a mess. We mentioned the bleakness and love that he shows in his face as he looks at his wife. And then he brings up Nero. Nero's a pretty bad guy. Nero actually orders the execution of his mother. He's sending her to be drowned, but he felt some emotion at his mother's departure and felt horror and pity. So we've got all sorts of examples. We could probably come up with many of our own as well if we wanted to, that go beyond Montaigne's own examples here. But you get the general idea, don't you? That we often have emotions that don't seem to mix well, we could say. So why is this? Why does this happen to us? Is it just that we happen to have these in us? So he says that there's another reason, and it has to do with our perception of reality. Reality is complicated. We don't grasp it all at once. So he says nothing has actually changed when we have these situations happen, but our mind contemplates or looks at, regarde in French, the matter, the chose in French, in a different light, d'un autre œil, right? So literally with a different eye. It looks at it from a different perspective, or it looks at it from another aspect. And here he actually says it represents it to itself. Cela représente par un autre visage, with a different face on it. Why would it do that? Well, like he says, everything has many angles and many sheens. So what it is that we think about, he gives the example of thinking about kinship, old acquaintances, and affections, seizing our mind and stirring them according to their worth, and then this change happens within ourselves. But it could also be really, realizing other things as well. It could be seeing the other person doing something, and you're like, oh man, this changes the way that I view them, right? And he goes on, and he's going to conclude here by saying, we deceive ourselves if we want to make this never-ending succession into one continuous whole. We are the never-ending succession, and we are not one continuous whole. And he says, when Timoleon weeps for the murder which with noble determination he committed, he does not weep for the liberty he's restored to his country. That's a good thing. He does not weep for the tyrant. The tyrant is a bad thing. He weeps for his brother who he's killed, right? He's done one part of his duty. Let us allow him to do the other. We very often have these conflicting duties, these diverse considerations that we bring up. That is part of human life, So we shouldn't try to shoehorn people into a nice compartment where we can say, aha, they are this person. They are this person who feels only this and not this in these circumstances. It's normal, Montaigne is saying, for people to feel more than one thing at the same time and to alternate between them depending on which ends up taking priority or controlling, if we want to use the military metaphor, the field that they are competing within.